Okay, guys, I'm sorry that WebEx dropped out. I'm just going to record the last couple of minutes of the lesson so that I feel like I've wrapped it up. Um, okay, and now I think I'm on the wrong page. Okay, so what I was going to ask was, do you think that traditional roles are still, do you think that it still works like that? So perhaps you have a mum at home who works, and yet she also does all of the domestic tasks. So does your mum come home from work and do the cooking and the cleaning, or does your dad come home from work and help with that kind of thing? That's just something to consider whether or not we've come very far with that yet. Um, So there was also some other things I had to overcome. So some newspapers initially ridiculed women who took on factory work. Some trade unions protested against women taking on other traditionally male jobs, and many men feared that the employment of women would lead to a reduction in men's wages. Sections within the Catholic Church warned against the consequences of women's new opportunities, and women were often admitted reluctantly to the armed services and denied the more interesting jobs. Okay, so then there's a little bit about Australia being under attack. So there was the bombing of Darwin on 19th of February 1942, just 4 days after the fall of Singapore. There were two air raids. The airfield was almost wiped out. 23 Australian and US aircraft were destroyed, and both Australian and US ships were sunk. Approximately 250 military and civilian personnel were killed. Japan wanted to prevent Darwin being used as a base for attacks on Japanese-held territory to Darwin's north. Another 62 air raids were made on Darwin, the last one being in November 1943, and there were also other raids on some other locations in Australia's north, so that's that map that we looked at earlier. There were some submarine attacks on Sydney on the 31st of May 1942. Reaction. So most Australians believe that the Japanese bombing raids and submarine attacks were in preparation for an invasion of Australia. This led to periods of panic and fear. It has come to light that in late 1941 Japan did have plans to invade Australia, but that by April 1942 those plans had been abandoned. So evidence indicates that Prime Minister Curtin became aware of the change in Japanese thinking, yet he did not publicly dismiss the general belief that invasion was possible because he wanted to make sure that people kept working really hard and were really committed to the war effort so everybody could enjoy the victory at the end. We also had a large number of Americans that came to Australia from 1941 through to the end of the war. Almost 1 million US servicemen were stationed for short periods in Australia. So they used Australia as an official base before they moved on to fight the Japanese forces in the Southwest Pacific. And they also returned from that theatre of war for like little holidays, weekend breaks, that kind of thing. US servicemen showed Australians a different way of life and brought about change in aspects of Australian society and culture. They were well paid, their uniforms were more stylish, they were generally easygoing and self-confident, and they expected to have American-style food, forms of entertainment, and consumer goods. They made US music such as jazz and swing popular, and they introduced new dance crazes. They greatly appealed to many Australian young women who they impressed with wartime luxuries such as silk, stockings, chocolates, and black market beer and cigarettes. It's estimated that between 12,000 and 15,000 Australian women became war brides. That is, they married US servicemen and went to live in the United States after the war. We had the Battle of Brisbane. So for some of the reasons just outlined, visiting US servicemen were resented by Australian servicemen and some of the civilian population. They complained that they were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Simmering tensions developed between Australian and US servicemen, which occasionally led to serious violence, and there was a major riot in Brisbane in November 1942. Then we had the end of the war. So the end of the war in Europe was of course important for Australians. So that was VE Day, you'll remember. However, the end of the Asia Pacific War was greeted even more enthusiastically because that was a lot closer to home. And the majority of Australian servicemen personnel were fighting in the Pacific Theatre, so they were now able to come home. Returning enlisted men and women to Australia was a huge operation. Over 450,000 service personnel had been discharged from the armed forces or demobilised by June 1946, and the repatriation of prisoners of war in Australia to Japan Germany and Italy could also occur. So we don't often think about that, how difficult it would have been to bring everybody home and to return prisoners of war. At the war's end, whether or not they wanted to or could afford it, most civilian and service women had little choice to return to traditional forms of women's work. This was in line with the government's strategy of settling ex-servicemen back into their former jobs and its new populate or perish policy, which aimed to greatly increase Australia's population. Women had reverted to simply being seen as wives and mothers. Okay, and there's an image there. This image came to represent the joy felt by Australians at the end of World War II. The footage was taken of the dancing man on the 15th of August 1945, and his identity is actually still debated now. So there is going to be a homework task. I'll email it to you guys and it will be on Daymap, but otherwise have a fabulous week and I will see you next Monday. Bye.